Hi guys. I wanted to cover another game here, the part 3 of the lecture on the Perk defense on the Austrian Attack. And this is more of a high-profile game. Two pretty famous grandmasters, Stephenson versus Gurovic, and I'm pretty sure everybody's at least heard of Gurovic. Stephenson is a pretty good expert on the Austrian Attack. So let's quickly get to our starting position here. I'm not going to go over these opening moves. So we looked at this position, and after the king goes to d7 here, and the knight takes, and then queen comes out to a5, and black takes on d4 here. And this is all pretty standard stuff. And after knight takes on d4, remember, black has two main options here. He can take the knight on d4, or he can defend his knight with h5. So after the knight moves, the queen is now unleashed onto that knight. And h5 is a good move, way of defending that knight. We want to meet this with h3, so that after knight c6, you notice black doesn't have to move the knight away right away. Because now if we take the knight, then now we're losing our knight on d4 here, where black can choose between taking with the bishop or the knight. So we don't want to take the knight, because then we'd have some major problems on the c3 square. So therefore, white played knight e2, which is good move. The knight dropped back to h7, since now that we were actually threatening it. But let's take a look at what happens if the knight would have went to f6. We would have played bishop e3 here. Knight to e4, for example. Very intuitive move. Now hitting this knight 3 times. And it looks scary, but you just castle kingside here. Knight takes on c3, for example. We just take with the b pawn. And now rook to f8. Well, if the bishop takes on c3 here, then just rook b1 hits the sensitive square here. So that after b6 here, now queen d3 hits the bishop a second time, and definitely white's getting the better of that position. And rook to f8 here. Just rook b1, b6. So we see black covering the b pawn here. Queen d3, same sort of schematic here. Queen f5, and now queen a6. White takes advantage of the hole on a6. Rook a to c8. Knight d4 hits the queen. So bishop takes d4, c takes d4, and now rook c7. Just queen a4 pinning that knight. And e6, c4. And we can already tell white definitely has a better position here. So h6 is probably the best retreat square for this knight. And actually, we're still in theory after this move. Bishop e3, knight f5, attacks that bishop, but the bishop can drop back to f2, where it's pretty good. Rook a to f8. So black's getting ready to retake the f pawn. Castle on the king side, rook takes f7. So let's take a look at bishop takes c3 here. Well, we just go knight takes c3 and rook takes f7. This was actually played in a game from where Yasser Seirawan had the black pieces here. But after a3 followed by b4 here, white got some initiative in that game. So after the rook takes on f7, knight e4, for example, rook c8, c3, knight d8, queen d3, knight e6, rook a d1, h4. Okay, and I want to just briefly look at queen takes a2, queen b5 check, king d8, queen takes b7, and you can already see white's getting the better end of this one. So So after h4 in this position, queen f3, queen a6. All right, so this was all played in the game here, and rook to f1, rook f e1, queen c6. Believe it or not, this is still theory. And knight d4 is a novelty, but Stephenson said in his notes on the game that actually knight c1, and this was later verified, gives white an advantage. Sort of a weird looking move, but the knight's rerouting to d3 where it is actually really good. So let's say something like king e8, knight d3, and we can see, you know, knight b4 is on the cards now. And if this queen ever moves, then that frees this knight to invade on the king side, and it's not much, okay, but it's, if you look at it with an engine, the engine will agree that white does have an advantage, at least by 2.5 points. So after knight d4 here, that was what was played in the game. Bishop takes d4, and that's what Gurevich played. Stephenson retook that bishop, and d5 was played, hitting the knight. He moved the knight to c3, and knight c7 was played. Rook c1, now queen d6. So far, you know, besides the black king being in the center of the board, black looks okay. It looks like he's surviving here. But let's see how this is going to go. Rook c2, rook f to f8, queen g4, queen f6. He's trying to hold it together. Rook e to c1 here, so doubling on the c file. e6, and now queen d1. Kind of mysterious. I can't say that I fully understand queen d1, but actually the d pawn had to be reinforced here, so that does make sense. Knight d6, knight e2, knight c to b5 is what was played by Gurevich. Now a4, and instead of moving the knight, Gurevich did the in-between move of rook takes c2, rook takes c2, and then knight c7. Going back, queen went to e1 here, g5 was played. He just takes on g5. After queen takes g5 and bishop takes on h4, so white won a pawn. Queen g6. Now queen c1. So hitting the knight, doubling on the c file here. Knight a6, bishop g3, knight c4, and king h2. Nice safety move, because black did control the open f file, and the queen is aggressively placed here. Knight b4, hitting the rook. So Stephenson went for an exchange sacrifice here and took with the rook after it was retaken. Queen takes c4, and knight c6 was played. But b4 here starts to look a little bit scary. That's just a lot of pawns coming in the center. The bishop is on a good square here. The queen is centralized. This knight is really the only piece that needs to get to a better square here. Rook c8, queen b5, pinning the knight. b6, because otherwise the b pawn was undefended. Queen a6, exploiting the hole on a6. Knight e7, and queen b7 check. So pretty entertaining game. Again, a high profile game. And king d8 was played here by Gurevich. Knight f4, hitting the queen. So the knight finally gets on a good square. Queen f5 here. Queen takes a7. And already you get the sense that white has something here. b5 was tried. Excuse me. A takes b5 was played, and now rook c4. So Gervik's hitting these two pawns here in the center, trying to chip away at white's attack. And b6 was played. So just ignoring the other b pawn, which falls, and now queen b8 check. So king goes to d7, and knight goes to d3 in order to hit this rook, but it's actually a sacrifice. And after queen takes d3 here, now queen d6, that was the point, because now this is picking up the black rook. After king e8, queen takes b4, knight f5. And bishop e5 was played, and Gervik resigned here because it becomes very impossible to stop this pawn on b6 here that's going to queen in 2 moves. It's impossible to stop this with anything. And actually white's king is pretty safe on h2, so there's really not a lot of hope here for black to do anything. But I thought it was a game worth going over. Let's recap. So we see this familiar Austrian attack position, and always remember that the king cannot take here because of knight g5, followed by queen takes g4. White's winning if black tries to take that pawn. So king d7 was necessary. And after knight takes b5, queen a5 is correct. H5, remember, always meet this with h3. This is a typical move that kicks this knight that we saw in the game before. And black doesn't have to move the knight immediately, but has this better tactical move, knight c6. Remember, just meet that with knight e2. So you're kind of defending, trying to hold this knight on c3 here. And when the knight goes back again to h6 here, we just develop our pieces. Normally, we get the knight to e3, dropping back to f2 if necessary. And this is our main setup. We can castle kingside here. Normally, if white has not played g4 or h4, castling kingside is perfectly fine. But if you've already started to push those pawns on the king side, you definitely want to go queenside in these Austrian attack lines. We saw black regain this pawn here, but white seemed to be solid this entire time here. And always remember, if they ever try to dare take on a2, queen b5 check, followed by queen takes b7 is going to be better for you. So those are some things to take away here. And also remember, this knight d4 move is not really the best here. If you can, try to remember this knight c1 maneuver, trying to get the knight to d3 here in this line. And that's the way Stephenson should have played in this game. But what happened in the game worked perfectly fine also. But objectively speaking, this is the only way that you're going to get an advantage, is by playing knight c1 and putting this knight on d3 here. So we're going to go over one more game after this, and that will conclude this lecture on the Austrian attack. Thank you, guys.